Welcome to Soft Sleep Tales, a channel where timeless stories, gentle narration, and quiet atmospheres help you drift into rest. Before we begin tonight's tale, I'd love to know, where are you listening from? Share it in the comments below. It's always wonderful to see our little community stretching across the world. Now, it's time to get comfortable. Settle into your bed or favorite chair. Close your eyes. Take a slow, deep breath. Let the day melt away. Allow my voice to carry you softly into sleep to a place where imagination flows and dreams begin. The decision was made on a Monday morning in November, which was, Patience Vane had always thought, precisely the kind of morning on which decisions of consequence tended to arrive. Not the bright, persuasive mornings of May that invited one toward recklessness, nor the soft capitulations of September, but a Monday in November, grey and deliberate, with a frost on the market square below the window, and the smell of coal smoke already heavy in the still air, the kind of morning that asked nothing of you except honesty. She had been sitting at her writing desk since 6:30, which was her habit of 31 years, and she had been looking at the page before her for the better part of an hour, which was not her habit at all. The page held the beginning of a letter. Dear Mr. Caldwell, I write on behalf of Mrs. Emmeline Farrow of Church Street, who wishes to convey to you her. And there it stopped, because at that point, Patience had set down her pen, removed her spectacles, pressed her fingers briefly to the bridge of her nose where the wire had left its mark, and understood with a clarity that required no further examination that she could not continue. Not today. Not this letter. Not, she suspected, with this light or this ink or these eyes. The spectacles had been made for her 3 years ago by Mr. Fielding on the High Street, ground to a prescription that had seemed at the time sufficient. And that was now, as she held them in her hand and looked at the thick lens that had once made the world legible, clearly no longer adequate. She could read large print still, with effort and in good light. She could see faces, the shapes of rooms, the market traders setting out their stalls below in the cold morning. But the fine work, the careful, even, well-spaced copperplate that had been her professional signature for 3 decades, the letters small enough to fill a page with substance, this was no longer available to her. She had known this was coming. She had known it for 2 years and had managed it, compensating with better candles, with larger paper, with the occasional polite fiction of blaming the ink rather than her own diminishing sight. But this morning, sitting before Mrs. Emmeline Farrow's unfinished letter in the grey November light, she knew that the managing was over. She sat for a time with the spectacles in her lap and the market square coming slowly to life below her, and she felt something she had not expected, which was not grief, precisely, and not relief either, but something between the two that had no single name, the feeling of a door being closed by a hand one had come to trust, firmly but without cruelty. 31 years. Patience Vane, letter writer, of Wenlock, Shropshire. She put the spectacles back on, picked up her pen, and wrote a careful note to Mrs. Emmeline Farrow, explaining that she would be unable to complete her commission and recommending the services of Mr. Thomas Arkle, who had set up a modest correspondence office in the town 3 years ago, and whose copperplate, while not distinguished, was perfectly serviceable. She blotted the note, folded it, addressed it, set it on the corner of the desk. Then she sat back and looked at the room. The room was small and faced east, which meant that in summer, the morning light came in generously and lay across the floorboards in long, warm oblongs that shifted through the morning like slow sundials. In November, it came in thinly, at an angle, and illuminated the dust in the air above the writing desk with the indifferent democracy of light that finds what is there rather than what one wishes to present. Patience had furnished the room herself 31 years ago, when she had first taken the cottage on the market square. The desk, which had been her father's and was large enough to accommodate 2 correspondences at once, the chair with the embroidered cushion that her mother had made in the last years of her life, the 2 bookshelves against the north wall, full now beyond capacity, books shelved too deep and stacked horizontally on top, a small fireplace which she had already lit this morning, and which was only now beginning to produce warmth rather than smoke, a single oil lamp on the desk, unlit since the daylight had arrived, and in the corner nearest the window, standing on the floor beneath the lowest bookshelf, a wooden chest. The chest was old oak, iron-banded, not large, perhaps 2 feet long and 18 inches deep, with a clasp lock whose key she kept on the same ring as her house key. She had not opened it in 4 years. She opened it every 4 or 5 years, when it became necessary to arrange its contents, to press down what had accumulated above the waterline of available space, to acknowledge that it existed and that she was its keeper. Inside the chest were the drafts. Every letter she had written in 31 years, the fair copies went to the clients and thence into the world. But the drafts, the working copies, on which she had developed each letter before committing it to the final clean page, she had kept. She could not have said, at the beginning, why she kept them. It had seemed at first simply a practical habit, proof, if ever proof were needed, of what had been said and by whose authority. But as the years had passed and the chest had filled, and she had occasionally revisited its contents, she understood that the keeping was not about proof. It was about what the letters contained, which was not merely the business of their senders, but the texture of their lives, distilled to the essentials of what could be said on a page, and what needed to be said. 31 years of what people had needed to say. She looked at the chest for a long moment. Then she got up, crossed the room, and took the key from the hook by the door. The lock was stiff. It always was, after a long interval of being closed, and required the particular combination of pressure and angle she had learned from long acquaintance. A firm turn to the right, and then a slight easing back before it would yield. It yielded now, as it always did, with a sound like a small decisive question answered. She lifted the lid. The smell reached her before her eyes had adjusted to the dim interior. Paper, old ink, the particular dry sweetness of documents that have been kept in wood for many years, and beneath that, so faint as to be nearly imaginary, the ghost of various perfumes and tobaccos and kitchen smells that had accompanied the clients when they sat across the desk from her and told her what they needed to say. She did not know if this was real or memory. She had decided long ago that the distinction did not matter. The drafts were arranged in bundles, each bundle tied with the same brown twine she had always used, and each bundle labelled in her own hand with a year. The oldest bundles were at the bottom: 1852, 1853, 1854. Pressed flat by the weight of 3 decades above them, their paper darker at the edges with age. The most recent sat on top, still relatively loose, still carrying the quality of things not yet entirely settled into being past. She knelt beside the chest, which was harder on her knees than it had once been, and placed her right hand on the topmost bundle without taking it out. 31 years, several thousand letters, several thousand people. The fire crackled behind her. The market square below the window was noisy now, with the Monday business of a Shropshire market town. The vegetable sellers calling, a cart horse on the cobbles, the bell of St. Milburger's beginning its slow count of 8. Patience knelt beside the chest and listened to the town beginning its day, and thought about all the days she had sat at her window while it did so, and written letters for the people who moved through it, the farmers and the widows and the young men about to leave and the old men who had stayed, and felt for the first time something of the full weight of it. Not a sad weight, simply the accurate weight of 31 years of paying close attention to other people's lives. She took out the first bundle. She had thought she would read at the desk, but the desk was associated with work, with the active, purposeful composition of letters, and this was not that. This was something else. So she moved instead to the armchair by the fire, which she rarely used in the mornings, having always considered armchairs a luxury of the afternoon, and she settled herself with the first bundle on her lap, and the fire doing its warming work to her left, and she untied the twine. The first letter in the bundle was dated the 14th of March, 1852. She had been 33 years old. She had been living in the cottage for 6 months. She had placed a small advertisement in the Wenlock Gazette: Miss Patience Vane, correspondence and letter-writing services, discretion assured, moderate rates, and had received, in the first weeks, a trickle of cautious inquiries that she had handled with the care of someone who understood that the cautious enquiry was itself a form of courage, that the person who had walked past her door 3 times before coming in had been gathering something, and that it was her business to make the gathering worthwhile. The first letter was from a farmer named Josiah Clement, who had been illiterate but had been too proud to say so directly, arriving instead with the explanation that his eyes were troubling him and that he needed a letter written to his brother in Chester concerning a disputed boundary fence. Patience had written the letter about the fence. She had also, over the course of 4 more visits that year, written his daughter's school application, a complaint to the county surveyor about the state of the Eastern Road, and a letter of condolence to a neighbour whose wife had died in October. She looked at the draft of the fence letter now. The handwriting was hers, recognisably, unmistakably, but younger, slightly more upright, the letters not yet settled into the particular, slight rightward lean that years of writing had gradually produced. The language was correct but careful, the carefulness of someone who had not yet entirely trusted her own instincts, who was still measuring each phrase against some external standard before setting it down. She had been 33, and she had been learning. By mid-morning, she had read through perhaps a quarter of the first year's bundle. The fire needed tending, and she tended it, And then she went to the kitchen and made herself a cup of tea. Plain, strong, no milk, which had been her preference since she was 20 and had never changed, and brought it back to the armchair and sat with the cup warming her hands and the bundle still in her lap. Outside the window, the market was at its fullest. She could hear the particular quality of a Monday market in November. Purposeful, not leisurely, the transactions conducted with the efficiency of people who were cold and wanted to be warm and had things to do before the light went. She knew most of the voices by name, even without seeing their faces. 31 years of writing letters for the people of Wenlock had given her an intimacy with the town that was different from ordinary social acquaintance, deeper in some ways, more guarded in others, the intimacy not of friendship, but of trusted confidence. She drank her tea and listened to the market and thought about Josiah Clement, who had been dead for 12 years now, and whose daughter, she had written the school application, had become a schoolmistress in Ludlow and sent a card at Christmas every year without fail, though the card was always brief, as if she was not quite certain whether the connection warranted anything more elaborate. She thought about the nature of what letters did. She had thought about this often over the years, in the way that a craftsman thinks about the nature of the material she works with, not abstractly but practically, from within the daily engagement with it. A letter crossed distances that the body could not cross. It crossed the distance between people who lived in the same house but could no longer speak to each other, and the distance between continents, and the distance between the living and the almost dead, and the distance between what a person knew and what they needed a formal document to establish. A letter was a body standing in for the absence of a body. It was a voice that could travel, and she had been the maker of those voices for 31 years. Not hers, never exactly hers, though her instincts were in every sentence, but belonging to the people who sat across the desk from her and told her, in their various ways, what needed to be said. She set down the empty cup and picked up the next letter. The draft she held now was from the autumn of 1852. She recognized it before she had fully read it. The particular spread of the ink, the 3 crossings out in the second paragraph that had required her to begin again on a fresh sheet, which had itself then become this draft. It was a letter from a young woman. Patience had never written her name in the draft, using only the initial M, which had been the young woman's own preference. She was 21 and frightened, and had walked 3 miles from her family's farm to ask for the letter to be written, and had arrived at the cottage door with her shawl held tight around her and a look on her face that Patience, who was only 12 years her senior, but had already begun to understand the lexicon of people who had carried something a long way, had recognized immediately. The letter was to Mr. H., the young woman's fiancé of 8 months. It was a letter breaking the engagement, not because of cruelty or unfaithfulness or any dramatic cause, but because, as the young woman had explained in a low voice, while Patience prepared the paper, she was afraid, not of him. He was, she said, perfectly kind, but of what the marriage would make of her life, of the particular shrinking she could already feel beginning, the gradual reduction of possibility that she had watched happen to every married woman she knew and that she could not. She had stopped here, pressed her fingers to her mouth for a moment, and then said quietly, "I cannot do it. I know what is expected of me. I cannot do it." Patience had written the letter. She had written it with care, in language that was honest without being unkind, that released the young man without diminishing him, that said the essential thing: "I am not able to be the wife you deserve," in a form that gave both parties something approaching dignity. The young woman had read the draft twice, made one small correction, changing "cannot" to "am unable," and then sat very still for a moment before folding it and putting it in her pocket. She came back 3 months later, Patience remembered. Not about the engagement, about a position she was applying for in a linen draper's in Shrewsbury. She got it. She wrote to me 2 years later to tell me so. The fire settled. The market continued below. Patience held the old draft and felt the full particular reality of it. The girl who had walked 3 miles, the letter that had been frightening to write and necessary, the small courage of the changed word. She did not read continuously. She had never been a woman who did one thing continuously when another thing was available. She had always preferred the rhythm of engagement and withdrawal, the work set down and taken up again, the room returned to after an absence that gave the return its freshness. So she read for an hour, and then she went to the kitchen and prepared a modest midday meal: bread, a piece of cheese, an apple from the bowl on the counter, and ate it standing at the kitchen window, looking out at the narrow back garden where nothing was growing in November, but the structure of things was visible. The bare stems of the climbing rose she had planted the summer her father died, the stone border of the herb bed, the old pear tree in the corner, whose branches were as familiar to her in their winter nakedness as in their summer leaf. The kitchen was the warmest room in the cottage and smelled of yesterday's bread and the dried lavender she kept in a bunch above the range. She had lived in this cottage for 31 years and knew it the way one knows a long companion, not by conscious inventory, but in the body, in the way the third step of the staircase would creak if you put your foot to the left of center, in the way the kitchen door swelled in wet weather and required a particular lift of the handle. She had come to Wenlock at 33, after her parents died, after the particular season of clearing and settling and disposing that follows a death, which she had conducted alone because she was the only child and had not yet had occasion to form the attachments that might have made it less solitary. She had come because the cottage was available and the rent was manageable, and because she had needed, with a clarity she had not tried to dress in more philosophical language, simply to be somewhere that was not the house in which she had grown up. She had not planned to stay for 31 years. She had not planned to stay for 5. She had planned only the letter in the Wenlock Gazette, the modest advertisement, the attempt to make herself useful in a way that drew on what she had, which was, she had thought then, clear handwriting, a reasonable education, a certain facility with language, and the ability to listen to what people were not quite saying. It had turned out to be enough. It had turned out, in fact, to be more than enough. She finished the apple and went back to the armchair and the letters. By late afternoon of the first day, she had read through the first 3 years, 1852, 1853, 1854, and had set the bundles on the floor beside the armchair in a small ordered stack. The fire was burning low and required another coal, and outside the window the market had long since packed itself away, and the square was quiet in the early dark of a November afternoon, the gas lamp on the corner already lit, casting its familiar amber circle on the wet cobblestones. Patience set the bundle she was holding on the stack, got up, and stood at the window for a moment. The square below was not empty. A woman in a dark coat was crossing it with a basket, and a man she recognized as the landlord of the Talbot Inn was talking to someone in a doorway. But it had the peaceful, deserted quality of a market town in the early evening, when the business of the day is done and the business of the night not yet begun. That interval of settled quiet that she had always found one of the most companionable times of day. She had been alone for 31 years. She had chosen this, or it had chosen her, or the two had been, as they often are, the same thing dressed in different grammar. She had not been lonely. She had been, for the most part, fully occupied by the letters, by the town, by the books on her shelves, and the garden in summer, and the long correspondence she kept with two friends from her youth, both now in other counties, both known now primarily through the medium she had spent her professional life mastering. There were things she had not had. She had chosen not to count them, for the most part, as losses. Or rather, she had counted them honestly once, early on, and then put the counting away as a completed task. She watched the woman with the basket cross the square and disappear into the lane beside the church, and then turned back to the armchair and the remaining bundles. The chair still held 28 years. She had, she thought, at least a week. The letters of 1855 contained the first one she had been asked to write for a child. His name was Samuel, and he was 9, and he had come to her door alone on a Tuesday afternoon in April, with a penny clutched in his left hand, and the explanation that he wanted to write to his uncle in Canada, who had gone there 2 years ago, and had sent a letter which Samuel's mother had read to him twice and then put away, and Samuel wished to reply. The penny was not sufficient. Her rate was 3d for a short letter. But she had taken it without comment and sat the boy down in the client's chair across the desk and asked him what he wished to say. The resulting letter was the shortest she had written to that date. Samuel wished his uncle to know that the dog had had puppies, 3 of them, and that the apple tree had blossomed early this year, and that his mother was well, and that Samuel himself was well, and that he hoped Canada was a good place, and that his uncle was not too cold in the winter. She had read the draft back to Samuel, who had listened with the total bodily attention of a child receiving something important, and had then nodded once with great seriousness and said that was right. The penny was on her desk still. She had kept it in the small ceramic dish beside the inkwell. She did not know why. It was simply one of those objects that had attached itself to a moment and refused to be separated from it. When she looked at it, she remembered Samuel's face, his absolute gravity, the puppy and the apple tree, the uncle in Canada who had presumably received the letter and who was, she had always hoped, not too cold. 1857 held the first letter she had written for a dying person. He was a retired schoolmaster named Edmund Howell, and he had sent his housekeeper to ask if Patience would come to him as he was too unwell to come to her. She had come, carrying her writing case, on a September afternoon when the town smelled of harvest, and the light was the particular heavy gold of early autumn that always made the world look more beautiful and more serious simultaneously. Edmund Howell was in his bed, propped against pillows, and he was clearly not going to recover, but he received her with a courtesy that was entirely undiminished by his condition, as if illness had taken from him everything unnecessary and left only the essential, and the essential included good manners. He wanted to write to his former pupils. There were 11 of them he wished to reach. Not one long letter, but individual notes, each one particular, each one saying the thing he specifically wished to say to that specific person. She had sat beside his bed for 3 afternoons. He had dictated, she had written, he had corrected, sometimes at length, sometimes with a single change of a word that altered the whole pitch of a sentence. He had died 2 weeks after the last letter was sent. She did not know if any of the 11 had written back. She had never asked, and the housekeeper, who might have told her, had left the town the following spring. But she held the draft of the first of the 11 letters now, addressed to a former pupil named William, who had apparently been the most difficult child in the school for several years and had become a man Edmund Howell described, with the particular satisfaction of a teacher recalling an unlikely success as the best thing I made, and she thought about what it had meant to sit beside a dying man and be the mechanism through which his last words reached the people he had loved. It had been the work she was most proud of in 31 years, not because it was the most eloquent. She had written more eloquent letters, but because it had asked the most of her, the patience to receive what he gave, the craft to put it into sentences that were his and not hers, the restraint to let him say what needed saying without the interference of her own instinct for expression. She was good at restraint. It was perhaps her most useful professional quality. And in this, as in other things, she was not entirely certain where the professional quality ended and the personal one began. The 1859 bundle contained a letter she had thought about more than any other in the 31 years since she had written it. It was not the most beautifully written. It was not the most consequential. She knew of at least 3 letters she had written that had materially altered the course of the recipient's life in large and traceable ways. It was not the most difficult to compose. It was simply the one she had thought about. It was from a woman named Clara Mossbridge, who was 47 years old and who came to Patience on a morning in January with a quality of controlled determination about her that Patience associated from experience with people who had made a decision that had taken them a very long time to reach, and that they were afraid, having reached it, to examine too closely in case it dissolved. Clara Mossbridge wished to write to her sister. They had not spoken in 6 years. The cause of the estrangement was something Clara had done. She told Patience this directly, without elaboration. I was in the wrong, and I have known it for 6 years, and I can no longer carry it. The letter Patience had written on her behalf was not an apology in the formal sense. Clara had not wanted a formal apology. She had wanted, as she explained, with the careful precision of someone who had thought about this for a very long time, to say that she understood what she had done and that she did not expect forgiveness and that she wished her sister well regardless. Not a transaction, an offering. Patience had written 4 drafts. The first 3 had been rejected by Clara as either too apologetic, which implied expectation of a response, or too cool, which implied insufficiency of regret. The 4th had found, through some instinct, Patience could not entirely account for the precise register Clara needed, the letter that gave everything without asking for anything in return. She had never known whether the sister replied. She had thought about this letter, about Clara Mossbridge, and the 6 years, and the thing that needed saying without expectation, on many occasions since. Not because it was unresolved, but because it had illustrated something she had taken time to fully understand, that the most important letters were often the ones that needed to travel in only one direction, that saying a thing mattered even when there would be no reply, that the value of the saying was in the saying itself and not in whatever came after. She turned the draft over in her hands and looked at the 4th draft's opening. My dear sister, I'm not writing to ask for anything. It was still, she thought, the best first sentence she had ever written. She took a break in the late afternoon of the 2nd day to walk. She walked every day, weather permitting, usually in the late afternoon, which was the time when the town had a different quality. The shopkeepers beginning to think about closing, the school children moving in noisy clusters along the pavements, the light starting its slow withdrawal from the upper windows, and the streets below falling into the grey preliminaries of evening. She had always found this hour good for thinking, and for the particular form of not thinking that sometimes produced useful thoughts. She walked her usual route, along the high street, left at the church, through the churchyard where the November trees stood in their bare uprightness, and the yew in the corner was as dark and permanent as it had always been, and then down the lane toward the river, which ran behind the town in a shallow valley and was visible from the lane as a silver thread between the grey fields. She was recognized by several people on the walk, as she was on most walks. The town was not so large that 31 years of residence had failed to make her familiar. Mrs. Pettiford from the drapers, who nodded with the particular smile reserved for people one knows to be reliable. Old Mr. Hatch, who had been delivering coal for as long as Patience could remember, and who said good afternoon with the emphasis of a man for whom the afternoon had been good and wished the fact to be recorded. A young woman she did not immediately recognize, who looked at her with the slight hesitation of someone who was not certain whether to acknowledge the acquaintance and then looked away, and who Patience realized halfway down the lane must be the daughter of Mrs. Hartwell, who had come to her twice in the early 1870s about letters to a solicitor in Shrewsbury. She walked to the river and stood for a moment on the stone bridge, looking down at the water, which was running high and fast after recent rain, brown and purposeful, carrying leaves on its surface in slow, erratic circles. She had stood on this bridge many times. In summer, the water was lower and clearer, and one could see the stones of the riverbed. In November, it was like this, full of itself, unconcerned with being observed. She thought about the letters in the chest. She thought about how many of the people who had written them were dead now, and how many had left the town, and how many were still here, living their current versions of the lives that had produced those letters, probably not thinking about the letters at all, the letters having done their work and been absorbed into the ongoing business of living. She thought about what it meant to hold all of that, to be the only person who held it. She turned from the bridge and walked back toward the town. The 1861 bundle contained a letter that had made her laugh at the time and made her smile now. It was from a man named Herbert Callow, who was a butcher of 55 with a face like a friendly ham and a manner of absolute sincerity that Patience had always found deeply appealing. He came to her on a Friday afternoon, smelling of the shop and holding his cap in his hands, and he explained that he wished to write a letter to Mrs. Dorothy Sparrow, who was a widow of the Methodist Chapel Committee, and who was, in Herbert Callow's considered opinion, the finest woman in Shropshire, and he wished to ask if she would do him the honour of accompanying him to the Christmas assembly at the Corn Exchange. He had sat down and composed his face into an expression of extreme seriousness. Patience had asked him what he wished to say to Mrs. Sparrow, and he had said, with the fluency of someone who had been rehearsing, "I wish to say that I have admired her for 4 years, that I have been unable to express this admiration adequately in person, because she makes me feel, if I am honest, somewhat inadequate in the area of words, and that I believe we might be well suited to each other on the basis of several conversations at the chapel door, which I have found to be the most enjoyable conversations of my recent years." Patience had written the letter. It was one of the most genuinely felt letters she had ever composed. Mrs. Dorothy Sparrow had replied. She knew because Herbert Callow had come back 3 weeks later, this time without his cap, and with a quality of contained happiness that was very like the quality of a man who had been holding a great deal in for 4 years and had been given permission to set it down. And the reply had been favourable. Herbert Callow and Dorothy Sparrow had married in the spring of 1862 and had come together to thank Patience with a small jar of honey from Dorothy's bees. She had never finished the honey. She had kept it on the kitchen shelf until it granulated, and then for some years after, until the jar had eventually been returned to the earth in one of her less sentimental tidying moods. But she remembered the honey. She remembered the quality of Herbert Callow's happiness when he came back with the reply. She held the draft and thought, this is what letters do at their best. They carry the thing the voice cannot carry. They cross the distance that pride creates between the feeling and the saying of it. In the middle of the 1863 bundle, she found a letter she had forgotten entirely, forgotten not in the sense of never having thought of. She thought of most of her letters occasionally, in the way that a craftsman thinks of work done, with the objective appraisal of someone who can no longer change it, but forgotten in the deeper sense. She could not, reading the draft now, clearly reconstruct the person who had dictated it. The draft was addressed to the matron, Shrewsbury Infirmary, and it was from a woman applying for a position as a nurse, and it was written with a plain, practical directness that told Patience that whoever had asked for it had been a plain, practical person without pretension. who wanted the letter to say the thing and nothing more than the thing. The letter said that the writer had experience of nursing, having cared for her father through a 2-year illness and her mother through a shorter one, and that she was 31 years of age and in good health, and that she believed nursing to be the work most suited to her abilities and her character, and that she would be grateful for the opportunity to demonstrate this in person. There was no name in the draft. The name would have been on the fair copy. Patience turned the draft over and looked at the back, which was blank. She looked at the date, June 1863. She thought about the women who had come to her in June of 1863 and could not isolate this one. A plain, practical woman of 31, wanting to be a nurse. She hoped she had got the position. She hoped she was somewhere in the country, grey-haired now, 61 years old, having spent her life in the work she believed herself suited for. She hoped the letter had done its work. She set it down and turned to the next. The winter afternoon came early, as it did in November, and by 4 o'clock the light from the window was insufficient, and she lit the oil lamp on the desk and moved her reading to its circle of warmth. The lamp was old, her father's, brought from the house when she cleared it, and its light was the particular amber of an oil lamp, warmer and less steady than gas, moving slightly with the air currents of the room, making the shadows shift in a way that was not unpleasant. She had always preferred it to the sharper light of a candle. It had a quality of inhabited warmth, of a light that knew the room it was in. She was reading letters from 1864 now. The town she was moving through in these letters was recognizably the same town she had lived in for 31 years, the same streets, the same institutions, the families whose names recurred across generations. But it was also the town of 20 years ago, the town before certain losses and certain changes, and reading it was like reading a story one already knew the ending of. She had written in 1864 a letter for a woman whose son was considering emigrating to Australia. The letter was to the son, an appeal, careful and honest, not to go. Not a command, not a prohibition. The woman had been specific about this. I do not wish to hold him by guilt, but I wish to say that I would miss him, and that I believe there is a life for him here if he will look for it, and that my door will always be open. She did not know whether the son had gone or stayed. She knew that the woman, Mrs. Alderton of the Shrewsbury Road, had died in 1871 because she had attended the funeral, as she attended most funerals in the town, out of the accumulated acquaintance of her profession. She supposed the question of whether the son had gone or stayed had been rendered academic by the subsequent history. But she thought about it now, about the particular courage of a letter that made an appeal without demand, that said, "I will miss you rather than you must not go," about the woman who had understood that love was not the same as ownership and had found the words to demonstrate the difference, about how often in 31 years she had been asked to say, "I love you" on behalf of someone who could not quite say it themselves. She found the letter from Daniel Price in the 1865 bundle, which she had not thought about in years, and which arrived in her hands now with the specific weight of things that have been important and then covered by time and are now suddenly, unexpectedly uncovered. Daniel Price was 17 when he came to her in the spring of 1865. He had his father's permission, which he knew because his father had come separately 2 days earlier to ask if she could assist his son, who needed, the father explained, with the slightly gruff tenderness of a man who found the tenderness difficult. A letter written for school, an application for a place at a grammar school in Shrewsbury. The son was capable, the father said, excellent at his numbers and not bad with his words. But the formal letter was beyond him, and the father could not help, and the mother was dead. And so, here was Daniel. Daniel had arrived with his numbers, and not bad with his words, and the particular quality of a young person who was trying very hard not to show that something important depended on this. He sat very straight in the client's chair. He answered her questions in complete sentences. When she read back the draft, he had closed his eyes briefly, the way people do when they are receiving something they hope for but were not certain of, and then opened them and said, "Yes, that's right. That's what I meant." She had written many school and university applications over the years. She wrote them with the same care she gave to everything, but the care was differently weighted. The weight of knowing that a young person's future was in the balance, that the letter she made would represent them in a room they could not enter, to people they could not speak to. She did not know what had happened to Daniel Price. He had not come back after the application was sent, which might have meant he had not been accepted and did not wish to return, or that he had been accepted and gone to Shrewsbury, and his life had moved in a direction away from the small letter-writer's cottage on the Wenlock Market Square. She hoped it was the latter. She hoped with a warmth that surprised her by its persistence after all this time, that Daniel Price with his numbers and his straight back and his closed-eye moment of relief had gone to Shrewsbury and made something of what she had helped him ask for. On the third evening, she sat by the fire with a cup of tea and did not read. She sat with the bundles stacked around her armchair, 1852 through 1866 on her left, the unopened years still in the chest. And she looked at the fire, and she thought. She thought about what it meant to have kept these letters. She had told herself for 31 years that the keeping was practical, professional record, proof of correspondence. But sitting here now, she understood more fully that the practical justification had always been secondary. The real reason was this: she had not wanted them to be gone. Each letter was a person, not the whole person. She knew better than to claim that, but a fragment of a person at a particular moment, the fragment that had needed to be said. A fence dispute, a broken engagement, a dying man's last words to his best pupil, a butcher's love for a widow, a mother's quiet, dignified grief at the prospect of her son's departure. These were not the entirety of those lives. They were the moments at which those lives had required a particular form of expression, and she had been the instrument of that expression. To keep the drafts was, she thought, to keep the moments, not the people. The people were gone or going, as all people went, but the moments themselves, pressed flat between the leaves of time, the way one presses a flower, which loses its colour and most of its scent, but retains somehow the essential shape of what it was. She was 64 years old, and she was the only person who knew these moments. When she was gone, the chest would be gone too. She had no children, and she would leave instructions, not from vanity or secrecy, but from the conviction that letters were private by nature and that the privacy did not expire with the sender. But for this week, in this armchair, in the firelight, she would know them. She put down her cup and took up the 1867 bundle. The last letter in the 1866 bundle had been from a woman she had never met. The letter was brought to her by a neighbour of the woman's, a Mrs. Hopcroft, who explained at the door that her neighbour, a Mrs. Jessup, was confined to bed with a chest complaint and wished to write to her daughter in Birmingham. And would Patience come? She had come. Mrs. Jessup was 73 and very small in her bed, with a face that illness had made transparent, the bones of it visible through the skin in a way that was not frightening, but simply honest, the final honesty of a body making its preparations. She had sharp, dark eyes and a dry, precise manner of speaking that Patience liked immediately. She wished to write to her daughter. The letter was to contain the following: instructions about the large dresser in the kitchen, which the daughter was to have, a note about the garden, specifically that the climbing rose on the south wall needed cutting back in February, or it would be unmanageable, a request that the daughter visit before Christmas, and the information that the blue tin box in the second drawer of the bureau held certain items that were for the daughter and not for anyone else. When Patience had written these items and read them back, Mrs. Jessup had listened without expression and then said, "Add one more thing. Tell her that I was proud of her. Tell her that I should have said so more often, and that I am saying it now." Patience had added it. She had put it at the end of the letter, after the rose and before the farewell, and she had written it simply: "I am proud of you, my dear. I should have told you so more often than I did." Mrs. Jessup had died before Christmas. Patience did not know if the daughter had visited. She knew the letter had been sent because she had taken it to the post herself at Mrs. Hopcroft's request the morning after it was written. She held the draft and read the last sentence again. "I am proud of you, my dear. I should have told you so more often than I did." She had written those words for someone else, but they were true words, and they had been wanted, and they had been said, and that was the whole of what she had been asked to do. The middle years, 1867 through 1878, were the fullest bundles in the chest. Her reputation in the town was established by then. The trickle of cautious first enquiries had become a steady traffic, and the work had settled into the rhythm of a life rather than an endeavour. She had her regular clients and her occasional ones, her simple letters and her complicated ones, and she had by this point long since stopped measuring her own instincts against an external standard, and had begun instead to trust them, which was a different thing and produced different work, more assured, more particular, more willing to take the risk of exactness. She read through these bundles with the particular pleasure of a person revisiting a period of her life when she had been, as she understood it now, at the full height of her powers. Not that the earlier letters were bad. They were not. They were simply the letters of someone still learning the full range of the instrument. But the letters of 1867 through 1878 had a quality of confidence in them, a clarity and economy that she could recognize now as the signature of a skill fully developed. She was proud of them. She had not always let herself be proud. It had seemed for many years like an indulgence, the professional equivalent of vanity. But sitting in her armchair on the fourth day of this reading, with the fire and the lamp and the November dark outside the window, she thought it was not indulgence. It was accurate. She had done this work well. She had given 31 years of careful attention to the letters of the people of Wenlock, and the letters were good. She allowed herself to know this. It seemed, at 64, the least she could do. The 1869 bundle contained a letter she had needed to refuse. A man had come to her in February of that year. She would not write his name even in the draft, having instinctively felt from the beginning that he was not a man whose name one wished to record, with a request that she write a letter to a woman on his behalf, a letter designed, as it became clear through the course of his explanation, not to communicate anything true, but to present a fiction as fact for the purpose of extracting money. She had declined. She had done so without drama, in the level tone she reserved for situations that required clarity without escalation. "I am not able to assist with this matter," he had argued. She had listened to the argument and then repeated with the same level tone, "I am not able to assist." He had left, and she had sat for a few minutes afterward, feeling the particular unsteadiness that followed an unpleasant encounter. And then she had made herself a cup of tea and returned to the desk and written the next letter, which was a perfectly ordinary enquiry about a disputed boundary, and which she had written with an extra degree of care as an antidote to the preceding hour. She had thought about him occasionally over the years. She did not know what had happened to him or to the woman he had intended to defraud. She hoped the woman had been spared whatever he had been planning. She had no way of knowing. But she thought about the refusal now, not as a source of discomfort, but as a point of the professional compass, one of the coordinates that defined the territory of her work. She had been asked over 31 years to do a number of things she had declined. Each refusal had been its own small act of definition, a line drawn in the same ink she used for everything else. In 1871, she had written a letter for a child again, this time a girl, Agnes, who was 11, and who came to Patience's door on a Saturday morning with a formality of bearing that Patience found both touching and impressive. Agnes wished to write to the editor of a Shrewsbury newspaper. She had read an article in the newspaper. Her mother took it, she explained, that had said something incorrect about the migratory habits of the swallow. Agnes knew it was incorrect because she had been watching the swallows that nested in the eaves of her family's house for 4 years and had kept careful records, and the article's claim was inconsistent with her observations. She had her records with her, in a small notebook of her own making, bound with thread, the handwriting small and precise and covered in dates and numbers. Patience had read the records. The child was right. The article was wrong. She had written the letter, which was 2 paragraphs long, citing Agnes's observations in language that was factual and polite and confident. And she had read it back, and Agnes had listened and then said, "Could you add that I have been watching them for 4 years? I think the duration matters." She had added it. The newspaper had published a correction the following week. Agnes had come back to tell her, with the same formality of bearing, but a quality of contained satisfaction about her that reminded Patience of nothing so much as herself at 11, correcting a teacher about a date in history with the same combination of perfect politeness and absolute certainty. She had charged Agnes nothing. Agnes had looked at her steadily for a moment and then said, "Thank you, Miss Vane. I will remember this." Patience smiled at the draft. She still thought of that child sometimes and wondered what she had become, and thought it was probably something involving careful attention to evidence and the willingness to be correct in public. The winter outside the cottage had deepened by the middle of the week. The frost was heavier each morning. She saw it on the market square when she opened the curtains at 6:30. The cobblestones whitened, the gas lamps surrounded by a halo of cold air, the sky above the rooftops the particular dark blue of a clear winter dawn. Before the light arrived, she had lit the fire each morning before sitting with the letters, and the room had accumulated a warmth that by afternoon was deep and settled, the warmth of a room that had been lived in continuously and that carried in its air the accumulated heat of a human life. She read through the 1873 bundle on the 5th morning and found in it several letters that moved her and one that she set aside and returned to 3 times during the day. It was a letter from a man named William Frost, who was 40 years old and who had worked all his life on the canal, first as a boy with his father and then as a working man with his own boat, and who came to her because he wished to write to his daughter, who was 17 and had been offered a place at a school for young women in Shrewsbury that would train her as a teacher. He wanted to tell her to go. He was afraid. He explained to Patience in a voice that was steady but quiet in the way of people who are being careful with themselves, that he would not say the right thing if he tried to say it himself. He wanted her to know that the life he had lived was a good life, a full life. He did not regret it. But he had not read until he was 30, when a schoolmaster on the canal had taught him, and the reading had been like being given a room he had not known was missing, and he wanted his daughter to have all the rooms from the beginning. All the rooms from the beginning. Patience had written the phrase as he said it, and then looked at it, and known it was the heart of the letter. She had put it at the center of what she wrote for him. Not in those exact words. He had asked for the letter to sound like himself, not like a letter writer, but in the spirit of them. The idea that a father who had come to reading late wished his daughter to have had it always, to have had all the rooms from the beginning. She had read it back to him, and he had sat very still for a moment, and then said, "That's it. That's what I meant." The afternoon of the 5th day she spent reading the 1875 bundle, which was the thickest of all the bundles, and which required 2 sittings separated by her walk, and a meal, and a long period of simply sitting with the lamp lit and the fire burning, and not reading anything at all, simply being in the room with the weight of what she had been reading. 1875 had been a difficult year in the town. There had been a business failure of some size. The tannery on the south edge, which had employed several families, and the failures had sent ripples through the community in the way of all economic disruptions, producing in their wake a crop of letters that were concerned with money, appeals to creditors, arrangements with landlords, explanations to family members in other towns, requests for work from employers who had none to give. She had written all of them with the same care she gave to everything, but she remembered the year as one in which her work had felt most directly necessary, most visibly the difference between a thing articulated and a thing that could not be said at all. The families who came to her had little. Most of them had lost their immediate livelihoods, and what she could give them was the letter that represented them well to the people who had the power to help or not help, the letter that made them visible in their full dignity rather than merely their need. She had charged less that year. She had not made a policy of it. She had simply charged less in each case than she might have, and had not remarked upon the reduction, and the clients had not remarked upon it either, which was the kindest possible arrangement. She read the letters of 1875 now, with the feeling that comes from revisiting a year one has outlived, the strange safety of retrospect, the knowledge that the people who had come to her in that frightened winter had, in most cases, found their way through it, as people do, as the resilience of ordinary life requires. There was one letter among the many she had never been entirely certain she had written correctly. It was from 1876, from a woman whose husband had been reported dead in an industrial accident, and who had received 3 months after the funeral a letter from a man in Liverpool claiming that her husband was alive and living there under a different name. The woman, Mrs. Clara Sefton, had come to Patience in a state of extreme composure that was clearly costing her a great deal. She wanted to write to the man in Liverpool. She wanted to ask him to tell her husband if her husband was indeed alive and in Liverpool, that she forgave him, that she did not wish to cause him trouble, that she wished him well. Patience had sat with this for a long moment before writing. She had asked Mrs. Sefton several questions, gently, carefully, aware that she was in the presence of someone navigating a situation of extraordinary complexity. The woman had answered each question with the same controlled calm, and the picture that emerged was of a woman who had grieved a husband who was not dead, who had in some sense already resolved the grief, and who wished to say something that she could not unsay, and that she had considered for a long time. Patience had written the letter. She had written it as precisely and cleanly as she could. The forgiveness clear, the absence of recrimination clear, the closing line a simple wish for his well-being that she had revised 3 times before she was satisfied that it said exactly what Mrs. Sefton intended, and nothing more. She had never known whether the letter reached its recipient, or whether the man in Liverpool had truly been who the first man claimed. She had never known whether Mrs. Sefton received a reply. She held the draft now and still felt the unresolvedness of it, not because she doubted the quality of the letter, but because the situation itself was one that did not resolve, that existed in a state of permanent incompleteness, a forgiveness offered to someone who may never have received it. A door opened into a room that may have been empty. This was, she had come to understand, the condition of letters. You sent them, and they left you, and you did not always know what they found. On the 6th morning, she woke before 5 and could not return to sleep, which was unusual for her. She lay in the dark and listened to the silence of the cottage and the small sounds within it, the settling of old timbers, a mouse in the wall above the kitchen, the distant call of an owl from the churchyard. And she thought, as she lay there, about the letter she had not yet come to in the chest. She knew it was there. She had known it was there for 31 years. The one letter she had written for herself and never sent. The only letter among all the thousands that was both hers and not hers, written in her own hand, intended as her own voice, for a recipient who had left the town the summer of 1868 and never returned. She had not thought about him often. She had thought about the letter more often than she had thought about him, which seemed to her a reasonable proportion. The letter was the thing she had made, and it was in the chest, and it was hers to account for. He had gone on to his own life in whichever direction it had taken him, and she had gone on to hers, and the town had held them both without distinguishing. She got up at 5:30 and went downstairs and lit the fire and made tea and sat in the armchair in the dark with the cup warm in her hands and waited for the light. It came, as it always did, slowly and without ceremony. A gradual greying of the sky above the rooftops visible through the east window, a shift from black to dark blue, to the pewter of a November dawn. The market square emerged from the dark in stages. First, the outline of the lamppost, then the pale cobblestones, then the shape of the opposite buildings, and finally, the full flat grey of an early winter morning. Patience sat with her tea until the light was sufficient, and then she took up the 1877 bundle and read. The 1877 bundle began with a letter she had written for Reverend Hartshaw, who had been the incumbent of St. Milburgers for 20 years, and who came to her with a regularity that suggested he found the act of writing letters, the solitary, private act of composition, difficult in a way that his public duties of speaking did not. He was a fluent preacher by all accounts. He was an uncertain letter writer, hesitant and prone to revision. He came to her in January of 1877 about a letter to the bishop. There had been a disagreement about the restoration of the church roof, the amount required, the source of funds, the degree to which the bishop's office was to be involved. Hartshaw had a clear position and could not put it on paper without the clarity dissolving into circumlocution. Patience had helped him find the clarity. She had asked him to tell her in plain language what he needed the bishop to understand, and she had listened to his answer, which was in fact plain and clear, and had then written the letter in the plain and clear language he had spoken, which he had apparently been unable to reproduce on the page without the intermediate step of speaking it aloud to someone who wrote it down. He had looked at the draft with something between relief and surprise, the expression of a man who had just watched someone else untie a knot he had been struggling with for an hour. "You simply wrote what I said," he observed. "More or less," she agreed. "I should have thought of that." She had not said what she thought, which was, "It is harder to do than it seems, because the page does not simply receive what you give it, it transforms it, and the transformation is not always in the direction you intend, and the skill lies in understanding why and how to prevent it." She had simply given him the draft, and he had taken it, and the roof had eventually been repaired, or at least begun. She had seen scaffolding on it the summer of 1878, and Reverend Hartshaw had continued to come to her once or twice a year until his retirement in 1881, when he had gone to Herefordshire with his sister, and she had written him a letter of good wishes that he had apparently appreciated, to judge by the brief warm note she had received in return. She found, in the middle of the 1878 bundle, a letter that had never left the desk. It was a letter from a woman who had come to her on a Thursday morning in March, a young woman of perhaps 25, with a child on her hip and an expression of absolute steadiness. She wanted to write a letter to her mother. The mother was in Wales. The letter was to explain that the woman had left her husband and was living with a friend in Wenlock, and intended to find work and a proper situation for herself and her child, and she wished her mother to know this before hearing it from anyone else. She had dictated the letter with the same absolute steadiness with which she had arrived. Patience had written it. The young woman had read the draft and then held it for some time, and the child had fallen asleep on her hip, and then she had looked up and said, very quietly, "If I send this, she will know, and if she knows, she will tell him." A pause. "I am not ready." She had set the draft on the desk. She had thanked Patience. She had paid the full rate. Patience had tried to return it, and the woman had shaken her head in the way of someone who is maintaining something essential about the transaction. She had taken the child and left. Patience had kept the draft. She did not know why, except that it was the draft, that it was hers to keep in the same way as all the others. She had never seen the young woman again. She hoped she had been all right. She hoped the child had grown up knowing that his or her mother had been absolutely steady. The draft was brief and simple and entirely sufficient, and it had never been sent, and she held it now in the firelight of a November evening 31 years later, and thought about letters that were written and not sent, about all the letters in the world that had been written and not sent, and what the not sending meant, and whether the writing itself was a kind of sending, even without the recipient. She thought, she believed it was. On the 6th afternoon, she read the letters of 1879 through 1881, which were the years she thought of, privately, as the years of the young. A disproportionate number of the clients in those years had been young men writing to employers, young women writing to relations about their plans, young people in various stages of beginning who needed their beginning articulated clearly on a page. She had always had a particular kind of attention for the young, not sentimentality. She was not, she thought, a sentimental person, having found over the years that sentimentality was not the same as feeling, and was, if anything, an obstacle to it, but a particular form of care, based on her understanding that a young person asking for a letter was often asking for something more than a letter, asking to be taken seriously, asking to have their intention treated as a real thing in the world rather than an ambition too unformed to merit a formal document. She had treated their letters as real things. She had written each one with the full weight of her craft, regardless of the fee, regardless of whether the ambition behind it was likely to be achieved. The letter was the thing she was making. Whether the world received it well was not within her control. She found, in the 1880 bundle, the letter from Daniel Price's younger brother. She recognized the name immediately. Price, the same family, the same father who had come to her about his elder son's grammar school application 15 years before. The younger son was 19 now, and he came not with his father, who was presumably dead, but alone. He wanted a letter for an apprenticeship with a clockmaker in Shrewsbury. She had written it. She had written it with an additional thought of the elder brother, still not knowing what had become of him, and with the feeling, which she did not examine too closely, that doing right by the second generation was a form of completing something with the first. The seventh morning, she woke with a clarity that she associated with a decision made in sleep, the kind of clarity that arrives when the mind has been working on something without one's conscious participation and has reached an answer before one is fully awake. She lay still for a moment and identified what it was. She was going to read her own letter today. Not at the end. She had been approaching it as if it were an ending, a conclusion she was building toward, the last thing in the chest. But it was not the last thing in the chest. It was one letter among several thousand, different from the others only in being hers, and there was no reason to treat it as a culmination. It was simply a letter, and this was simply the day she would read it. She got up and dressed and made her tea and sat with it by the window and watched the market square in the pale early light. The Monday market had come again. It was Monday, her second Monday of this reading, which meant she had spent a full week with the chest, had read through 31 years of other people's letters, and was now at the end of the unsent ones. She opened the chest and found the final bundle, 1882 and 1883, the two most recent years, and below them, in the very corner of the chest, wrapped in a piece of cloth that she had put there herself 31 years ago, her own letter. She left it wrapped for now. She would read the recent years first. The 1882 and 1883 bundles were the most familiar, the letters she had written most recently, the clients whose faces she could still see clearly. She read them with a different quality of attention than the earlier ones, not the reconstructive attention of memory, piecing together a face from a name, but the simple recognition of things still present to her, the faces still in the town, the stories not yet concluded. She read the letter she had written for Frances Rowley, the blacksmith's widow, who had wanted to write to her son-in-law in Manchester about money she was owed from her late husband's estate, a clear, firm, dignified letter that had apparently produced the desired result because Frances Rowley had come back 3 months later to say so, with a quality of resolved satisfaction about her that suited her very well. She read the letter she had written for young Miriam Haight, who was 18 and had wanted to write to her aunt in Ludlow about a disagreement that had been running in the family for 2 years, and whose letter had been the most difficult to pitch correctly, not because the situation was complex, but because Miriam's way of speaking had a directness that on the page risked reading as bluntness, and the work had been to preserve the directness while softening the edge just enough to be received. She read the letter she had written for old Thomas Benbow, who was 81 and had wanted to write to each of his 5 children something of what he wished to leave them. Not property, but thought. 5 letters, one for each child, each one specific, each one containing the particular quality of his attention to that child across 81 years of watching. It had taken 3 afternoons. It had been among the work she was most satisfied with in recent years. She read the last letter in the 1883 bundle, which was a simple letter of recommendation she had written 6 weeks ago for a young woman applying for a position, and then she set the bundle on the stack and sat for a moment with the chest almost empty before her. The cloth-wrapped letter was in the corner. She reached into the chest and took out the cloth-wrapped letter and set it on her knee without unwrapping it. The cloth was a piece of brown wool flannel, part of a shawl that had been her mother's, cut from an area that had worn through at the edge. She had wrapped the letter in it when she put it in the chest at some point in the mid-1850s, and had not unwrapped it since. She sat with it in her lap for some time. The fire was burning well. The lamp was lit. Outside, the market square was at its Monday fullness, the voices of traders and buyers coming up through the window glass. Present, familiar, the sound of the town she had lived in for 31 years. She unwrapped the cloth. The letter was in 2 sheets, written close, in her own hand, younger, as all the oldest letters were, more upright, less settled into the particular lean of decades of practice, but recognizably hers, recognizably her voice, her way of constructing a sentence. She had written it in 1852, the same year she had arrived in Wenlock, the same year as the fence dispute, and the young woman breaking her engagement, and Samuel, the child with his penny and his puppy, the same year of beginnings. She read. The letter was to a man named Edmund Calloway. He had been 29 when she wrote it, newly arrived in Wenlock as assistant to the solicitor's practice on the High Street. She had been 33. They had met at the house of a mutual acquaintance. She could not now remember whose house, only the quality of the evening, the firelight, the conversation that had surprised her by its ease, and had spoken for perhaps an hour. And the hour had the particular quality of certain conversations that seem, while they are happening, to be saying more than the words contain. She had not seen him again for 3 weeks, which she had spent telling herself that she was not thinking about the conversation. Then she had seen him in the street, and they had spoken briefly, and he had asked if she would like to walk on Sunday, and she had said yes. They had walked on 6 Sundays. On the 7th Sunday, he had told her that he was engaged to be married to a woman in Hereford, that the engagement had been arranged before his arrival in Wenlock, that he had not spoken of it because he had not. He had stopped here, looked at the river, looked back at her, because he had not wanted to. She had thanked him for telling her. She had walked home. She had sat at her desk and written the letter. The letter said what she had needed to say, not the full extent of what she had felt. She was not then, and was not now, a woman who believed that the full extent of feeling needed to be communicated in all its dimensions, that the value of a thing was proportional to its completeness. The letter said what was essential, which was this, that the 6 Sunday walks had been among the most entirely pleasant hours of her adult life, that she was sorry to know they were over, that she wished him well in his marriage and in the work he had come to Wenlock to do, and that she was glad to have known him briefly, in the particular way that certain brief acquaintances are more fully themselves than much longer ones. She had written 4 drafts. The one in her hand was the 4th. She had not sent it. She had considered sending it for several weeks, had set it on the desk ready to seal, had on 2 occasions carried it to the door with the intention of going to the post, and had on both occasions returned without having gone. She had not been able to say precisely why she hadn't sent it, only that when she held the sealed letter and imagined it leaving her hands, she felt something she had not expected, the sense that the letter was more perfectly itself unsent than it could be sent, that what it said was true and complete and did not require an answer, and that an answer, whatever form it took, would necessarily reduce it, that the not sending was a form of keeping. She read the letter through to the end and then held it for a while without putting it down. Edmund Calloway had left Wenlock in the autumn of 1855. She had seen him occasionally in the 3 years between the Sunday walks and his departure, in the street, at the church, at the same mutual acquaintance's house, and they had spoken politely and without awkwardness, which was a thing she was proud of, the maintenance of ordinary courtesy, when ordinary courtesy required some effort. She did not know what had happened to him after he left. She had not inquired. She had, for a period in the late 1850s, occasionally found her thoughts returning to him in the way of unfinished things, and she had allowed the thoughts their passage and then returned to the desk and the letters and the town. She had, she thought, had a good life, a full life. The 31 years of letters, the town she knew completely, the books on her shelves, the garden in summer, the friends in other counties whose letters she had kept in a different box for different reasons. She had not had what Edmund Calloway might have given her, but she had had what she had had, and she did not count it as less, only as different. She looked at the letter. She had been 33, and she had written to say that 6 Sunday walks had been among the most entirely pleasant hours of her adult life. This was true. It was still true, 31 years later. The walks had been what they had been, and no subsequent accounting changed them. She folded the letter carefully, the way it had been folded, along the same creases. She put it back in the cloth. She sat for a long time after that, with the cloth-wrapped letter in her lap and the fire doing its steady, patient work. She was not unhappy. She wanted to be clear about this with herself, as she had always tried to be clear with herself about what she actually felt rather than what she thought she ought to feel. She was not unhappy. She was 64 years old, and she was sitting in a room she had lived in for 31 years, surrounded by the drafts of letters she had written for the people of the town she had chosen. And in her lap was a letter she had written for herself at 33 and kept for 31 years, and she was entirely, accurately, specifically all right. She thought about the letters in the chest. She thought about all the people who had sat across the desk from her and told her what they needed to say. She thought about Josiah Clement and his fence dispute and his daughter, who was now a schoolmistress. She thought about the dying schoolmaster, Edmund Howell, and his 11 letters to his best pupils. She thought about Clara Mossbridge and her first sentence, "I am not writing to ask for anything." She thought about Herbert Callow and his love for a widow and the honey they had brought her, and William Frost with his desire to give his daughter all the rooms from the beginning. She thought about all of them, all the thousands of people who had needed to say something and had come to her to help them say it. And she felt, sitting in the armchair on the 8th of November, the weight and the warmth of that, both simultaneously, in the way of things that are genuinely large. She had been useful. She had been, in the specific way her particular gifts had allowed her to be, of real use to the people around her. For 31 years, in the small front room of a cottage on a Shropshire market square, she had been the mechanism through which people found the words for what they needed to say. This was enough, more than enough. It was, she thought, precisely what she had been made for. She went to the desk. She had not sat at the desk since the first morning, since she had set down Mrs. Emmeline Farrow's unfinished letter and understood that the fine work was no longer available to her. She had not sat there since, because there was a small grief in sitting at a desk where one could no longer work in the way one had worked, and she had been giving the grief its appropriate space before addressing it. But she sat now in the familiar chair, with the familiar desk before her and the familiar view of the market square through the window, and she felt the desk as an old companion rather than a lost facility. She opened the top drawer. The pen was there, the good one, the one she had had for 15 years. The ink was in its pot. The notepaper was in the side compartment, cream and smooth, the particular weight she had always preferred. She took a sheet. Her hands were steady. Her eyes, with the spectacles, could manage larger print, a broader hand, the less exacting form of writing that was not professional copperplate, but was still legible, still hers. She wrote 3 letters that afternoon. The first letter was to the schoolmistress in Ludlow, Josiah Clement's daughter, whose name she had found in the drafts and confirmed in her own memory, Miss Sarah Clement of Ludlow. She wrote to tell her that she had been reading through her records and had come across her father's letters and had wished to say that his pride in her had been evident in everything he had asked her to write on his behalf, that his letters home were among the finest she had written, and that she hoped Sarah was well and was content in her work. It was a short letter, but it was the right letter, she thought, or close to it. The broad, careful script was not elegant, but it was legible, and the words were true. The second letter was to Thomas Benbow's eldest son, who lived in Wenlock still, and whose name she knew from the father's letter of the previous year. She wrote to tell him that she had known his father for many years, and that in her professional opinion, which she offered as such clearly, he had been a man of unusual quality of mind, and that the letters she had written on his behalf had been among the most thoughtful she had ever been asked to compose, and that she hoped the family was bearing the loss of him well. She folded both letters and addressed them and set them on the corner of the desk for the post in the morning. The third letter she wrote more slowly, with more revision, stopping twice and beginning again. It was a short letter, 1 page in the end, to a woman she had known for many years, a woman who had never once come to her professionally, but who had been, in the quiet way of women's friendships, conducted mostly in passing, at the church door, in the market, occasional evenings at each other's houses, one of the most reliable presences of her life in Wenlock. The letter said simply that she valued the friendship, that she had not always said so, that she was saying it now. She had learned this, she thought, from Mrs. Jessop's letter, from the dying woman in her transparent bed, who had added at the end the thing she should have said more often. I should have told you so more often than I did. In the late afternoon, she took the letters of Thomas Arkell's address from the drawer where she kept such things and wrote him a note. She told him that she would be closing her letter-writing service, that she had a number of clients who might find themselves in need of a correspondent, that she would be pleased to recommend his services to them, and that she hoped he would give them the same care she had tried to give. She paused at the same care and looked at it for a moment. It was slightly presumptuous. She did not know his work well enough to know whether he gave the same care. She changed it to good care, which was both accurate and honest. She sealed the note and added it to the small pile on the corner of the desk. Then she sat for a moment with her hands flat on the surface of the desk and felt the desk beneath her hands, the grain of the old wood, the slight unevenness where the surface had been repaired once, years ago, the familiar cool of the leather writing surface, and thought about all the letters that had been composed on this surface, all the words that had begun here and gone out into the world. She thought it was a good desk. Before dinner, she went to the chest and began to sort the bundles. She did not intend to destroy them. She had thought about this carefully and had reached a clear decision, which was that the letters were not hers to destroy. They had been written for other people and about other people, and they contained confidences that had been given to her in trust. The trust had not been for destruction, but they needed to be sealed. She had thought about this too, and her conclusion was that the chest should be locked and left to her solicitor with instructions that it be held for 20 years after her death, and then destroyed unread. She could not know whether the instruction would be followed. She would not be there to know, but she could make the instruction clearly and with the full weight of her intention, and it would be what it would be. She arranged the bundles in the chest in chronological order, as they had been, and then lifted the cloth-wrapped letter and looked at it for a moment. She put it back in the corner of the chest, in its cloth, in its place. It belonged there. It was one letter among thousands, hers among theirs, the one she had written for herself among all those she had written for others. It did not need to be set apart from them or disposed of differently. It was part of the work of 31 years, and it would stay with the rest of it. She closed the chest. She turned the key. She heard the lock engage with its familiar small, decisive sound. She made her dinner, a simple meal, more than adequate, and ate it in the kitchen with a book propped against the bread box, as she often did when eating alone, which was to say, as she almost always did. The kitchen was warm from the range and smelled of the meal and the dried lavender and the particular comfortable smell of a kitchen that has been cooked in regularly for many years. She had always liked the kitchen in the evening. It was the most practical room in the house. No pretensions, no ceremony, just the honest work of feeding and washing and the small domestic order that kept everything else possible. She read without strong attention to the page. Her mind was elsewhere, not restlessly, but quietly, ranging over the week that had passed and the letters she had read and the things she had thought. She thought about continuance. She thought about the letters and the people in them, the 1,000 small human moments that had passed through her hands, and she thought about what they amounted to, what they said about the 31 years of attending she had done, and the town she had attended to. They said, these people were here. These people needed to say something. These people trusted someone to help them say it. And the someone was here, in this town, in this room, with this pen and this paper, and the saying was done. She thought this was enough. She thought, with the full and settled conviction of someone who has examined a question carefully and arrived at a conclusion she does not need to revise, that a life built from such moments was a life honestly and fully lived. She finished her dinner, washed her plate, and went upstairs. She sat at the window of her bedroom for a time before sleeping, as she sometimes did. The window faced east, the same direction as the writing room below, and looked over the back garden and the rooftops of the lane behind, and beyond them, the fields that ran toward the hills. The night was clear, the first clear night in a week, and the stars were visible above the rooftops. Not brilliantly, the town's gas lamps dimmed them, but present, the brightest ones legible even through the light pollution of a November night in a market town. She had looked at this sky for 31 years. She was not sentimental about it. She was simply accustomed to it, in the way of being accustomed to what one has lived with, knowing it as a familiar presence, a thing that was there, that had always been there, that asked nothing and gave, in its constancy, a form of companionship that was different from the companionship of people, but was, in its own way, real. She thought about what she would do next. She had already, in the week of reading, without planning it, begun to understand what the next thing was. The fine copper plate was finished, but reading was not finished. Listening was not finished. The particular quality of attention she had trained over 31 years of sitting across the desk from people who needed to say something had not finished with the copper plate. She had already thought, the previous afternoon, of 3 people in the town who needed someone to read to them. Mrs. Pettiford at the draper's, whose eyes had been failing for 2 years. Old Mr. Rathbone, who was housebound. A young woman on the north side of the square, whose child was ill and who had been looking drawn and depleted for weeks. She could not write the fine letters any longer. She could read aloud. She could sit beside someone and receive what they needed to say and help them find the words and pass the pen. The work was different. The work continued. She looked at the stars above the rooftops for a while longer, and then she went to bed. She slept well. She had slept well all week, which she attributed partly to the November dark and the warm room, and partly to something harder to name. The particular quality of sleep that comes when one has spent many hours in honest engagement with the past, and has put it, not away exactly, but into its proper order. She woke at the usual time and lay in the warming dark and listened to the town beginning its day. The first carts on the cobblestones, the bell of St. Milburga's at 7, the distant voice of the market's earliest arrivals beginning the weekly business, and she felt rested in the specific way of someone who has set something down that they had been carrying for a long time without knowing it. Not the grief of it. She had never experienced the letters as a burden. They had been the fabric of her working life, not a weight on it. But there was a quality in the week of reading that was not only professional reflection, that was also, she understood now, a form of farewell. She had said goodbye to the work as it had been, in the only way that seemed right to her, which was to hold it fully and consciously for 1 week before releasing it. She got up and dressed and went downstairs. The 3 letters she had written were on the corner of the desk. She took them downstairs, put on her coat, went out into the November morning. The market square was cold and smelled of frost and horses, and the coffee from the small shop that opened early for the traders. The sky was a pale, washed blue, the kind of sky that came after a clear, cold night, and that would not last long, but was, while it lasted, very beautiful. She walked to the post office. The walk was 7 minutes, and she had made it thousands of times in 31 years. She made it now with the same pace, neither hurrying nor dawdling, that she had always kept, and she noticed as she walked, as she always noticed, the quality of the morning, the frost on the window-sills, the smoke beginning from chimneys, a cat on a doorstep sitting in the thin sun, with the absolute conviction of cats that warmth is their right. At the post office, she handed the 3 letters to young Peter Marsh, who had been the post office assistant for 2 years, and who had a habit of reading the addresses on letters with a brief professional curiosity that she had always found forgivable. He glanced at the 3 addresses. He looked up at her with the slight curiosity of someone who has noticed a departure from the usual order of things. She normally posted letters for other people, many at a time. She said nothing in explanation. He took the letters and weighed them and told her the cost, and she paid. She stepped back out into the morning. She stood on the step of the post office for a moment before turning back toward the square. The letters were gone. They would arrive tomorrow or the day after. Sarah Clementine Ludlow, Thomas Benbow's son, 2 streets away, her friend whose name she had not spoken aloud in months because there had been no one to speak it to. They were going where they were needed to go. She stood in the November morning with the cold air on her face and the market square busy and various before her, and she thought about all the letters she had sent over 31 years, and what they had carried and where they had arrived and what they had done. She thought about the ones that had arrived too late, and the ones that had never arrived at all, and the ones that had arrived and changed things, and the ones that had arrived and changed nothing visible. She thought about the one that was still in the chest, wrapped in its cloth, in its place. She thought about letters that travelled in only one direction and arrived nonetheless, about the saying of the thing mattering separately from whether the thing was heard. She had made this argument in the dark of a sleepless morning, lying in her bed 31 years ago. She had been 33, and she had believed it because she needed to believe it. She believed it now because she had seen it proven in letter after letter, year after year, that the making and saying of a thing had its own value, its own completeness, that did not depend on what came after. The cold air on her face was very clean. She turned back toward the square. She went home. She hung her coat on the hook. She went into the writing room and stood for a moment in the doorway, looking at the room, the desk and the chair, the bookshelves, the fire laid but not yet lit, the chest in its corner, locked now, the key on its ring, the window with its view of the market square in the November morning. This was the room where 31 years of work had happened. This was where she had sat across the desk from farmers and widows and school children and dying men and young women walking 3 miles in January, and butchers in love and families in crisis, and all the various forms of the human need to say something that the heart could not carry alone any longer. She crossed to the desk and sat down. Not because there was a letter to write. She had written her 3 letters and sent them, but because the desk was the place where she had always sat, and the chair was the place where she had always worked, and the window was the window she had always looked out of, and it seemed right on this particular morning to be in the place that was hers. The market below was in full voice now. She could hear the particular Monday music of it, the calling and answering, the cartwheels, the old Mr. Hatch's coal delivery beginning somewhere in the lane to the left. In an hour the square would be at its fullest. In 3 hours it would begin to quiet. In 6 it would be empty, and the gas lamp would come on and cast its amber circle on the cobblestones. She had seen this cycle 31 years of Mondays. She opened the notebook she kept for her own reading notes. Not the professional notebook, but the private one, the place for her own thoughts. And uncapped the char, pen and wrote, in the broad clear hand that was what remained to her, the date, and then a few lines. Not a letter, simply what was true. The chest is closed, and the key is on its ring, and the letters are where they belong. Whatever I was meant to do with them, I have done. Whatever they were meant to do in the world, they have done. I am 64 years old, and I am sitting at my father's desk in a room I have lived in for 31 years, and outside the window, the market is going on in the particular way it has always gone on. The frost has lifted from the cobblestones. The sky above the rooftops is the pale clear blue of a November morning after a cold night. I am very well. She put down the pen. She looked at the market square. The clock on St. Milburger's began its slow count of 9. She listened to it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And when it finished, she sat in the silence that followed, which was not empty but full, in the way of all silences that come after a long sound has ended, and she felt, with the quiet completeness of something finally and fully at rest, entirely herself, entirely here, entirely home, Finn.